I'm really happy to welcome you to the second part of our afternoon's program. My name is Liza Bauer, and I'm the interim scientific manager of the panel on planetary thinking at this university, and we have initiated this event together with our dear fellow Claudia J. and whom I'll have the pleasure to say a few words about now. So, as you all know, the afternoon runs under the heading of Gaia and Indigenous Knowledge, and it constitutes the second element of a 4-part workshop series, which is entitled What Earth is Made of. So the initiator of the series, Dr. Claudia J. is a tenured professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at the State University of New York, Potsdam. And most importantly, she's current fellow in the Planetary Scholars and Artists in Residence program at our panel. And therefore, I've had the great pleasure to work alongside with Claudia closely within the past few months. So at this point, I think it's high time to express my heartfelt gratitude to you, Claudia, for providing our panel with lots and lots of colors, a massive amount of new books, and of course, with all of your brilliant ideas. Claudia's career in academia, international development, and women's health spans no less than 4 decades and nearly all continents, so that her expertise also stretches into numerous directions. She published scholarly articles in the fields of ethnobotany, indigenous knowledge, gender studies, and even international business and environmental justice, and of course, environmental literature. And she herself says that her great passion lies within teaching these things in classrooms, at workshops, at lunch breaks, and as we have had the pleasure to experience in October, even on organic farms such as Gladbacher Hof. And on top of all of that, she's also a visual artist, a creative writer, and she serves as on the boards of directors of organizations that are committed to renew the vitality of the earth and our communities. Hence, the workshop series can be seen as a conglomerate of her diverse areas of expertise. As its element included farm work, it will now engage with the Gaia Hypothesis, indigenous knowledges, and it will be complemented by a creative writing workshop, which takes place in this building 3 levels up tomorrow morning. And anyone who's interested can still sign up for that. Yeah, her visual art will be exhibited at Makerspace in the city center. We'll celebrate the opening of the exhibit tomorrow from 5 p.m. onwards, and you're all warmly invited. But now she'll be talking for about 40 minutes, and our dear guest Matthias Klestel, who's sitting next to her from the University of Klagenfurt, will give a brief response to her keynote and therefore kick off our plenary discussion, to which we invite all of you here in the room and of course also people in the chat to join. Coffee break and film screening are to follow, but we'll get to that later. And now, without much further ado, please join me in welcoming Claudia.
Thank you. And thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for your patience. And special thank you to those who are listening online. So I invite you, as I often do in lectures, to listen either from the typical academic perspective with a pen in your hand and a pad of paper, and or listen as story, because as an environmental humanist, I like to tell stories. And so this can also be story time, or it could be a combination of both. When I think of listening as story, I think of our traditional point of view as humans sitting around, usually a fire, sitting around a living room, listening to us tell stories. So I invite you to both of those ways. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Claudia Ford. I'm a fellow at the panel on planetary thinking, and I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon. I'm grateful to the president of Justus Liebig University, Professor Mukherjee, and to the director of the panel on planetary thinking, Professor Klaus Liebig, as well as my colleagues here in Gießen at the university and on staff at the panel. So thank you for providing me with this opportunity. This would be the first in the James Lovelock Memorial Lecture at JLU, and my subject matter today is What Earth is Made of, Planetary Materials, Indigenous Knowledge, and the Gaia Hypothesis. The exploration in art and science is added because as you've heard, the panel fellowship specifically invites the convergence of scholarly and artistic work to address critical ideas within planetary thinking. And this semester, I'm representing both scholar and artist as I work in both domains, both as a professor in environmental studies, but also with an MFA in fine arts and a studio practice in visual arts. So besides this lecture, which provides an overview of my research on Gaia theory and Indigenous knowledge, as you heard, there'll be 3 other arts-related events remaining in this workshop. And because the theme of the fellowship this year is planetary materials, I'm really excited to examine this theme in multiple and different ways. I like to be inspired in my talks and to feature the artwork of Black and Indigenous, usually women artists, in my slide presentations. They're usually people that myself and my audience have not heard of. So for today, I'm introducing and featuring the beautiful work of 2 Canadian First Nation artists, Maxine Noel, who is Santi Ogala Sioux, and Christy Belcourt, who is my tea. Like most of my research projects, or most of our research projects, my exploration of this topic is driven by questions. So today I begin by presenting some of these questions and talking about James Lovelock and the Gaia Hypothesis, discussing Indigenous knowledge paradigms, and then concluding with a summary of why this research is important to our current challenges of environmental degradation and the climate crisis. I will examine the research and writing of a number of scholars across a truly interdisciplinary range of sources in the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. I have an extensive bibliography for this talk, and it's already shared on the panel website as a PDF. But the summary of this research is really a call to action for each and every one of us. As both an environmental scholar and an environmental activist, I could not have it be otherwise. So the one question that really motivates the overall framework of this research is that given the multiple and different stories about human longing and responsibility into relationship to what we call nature, what actually transpires at the intersection of these environmental worldviews and the Gaia principles, given this cultural diversity that drives human society. My interest then is about the different paradigms by which we approach environmental issues, about epistemic plurality, the various and very unique ways that we as humans have developed of knowing ourselves and the world. We're good? Okay. So, James Lovelock, for whom this talk is named, was born in Hertfordshire, the UK on the 26th of July, 1919, and he died on the 26th of July, 2022, at the age of 103. He was an engineer, an inventor, a scientist, a teacher, and an independent academic. He consulted for NASA and many other global scientific companies and big universities. His academic specialties were as a chemist and a geologist, and among many inventions, he developed an instrument that measures contaminants in the air, thereby beginning a process of showing the extent of the dangerous dispersal of CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, a class of compounds used for refrigerators, air conditioners, solvents, and aerosol sprays, eventually leading to what we all know as the singularly successful Montreal Protocol for International Cooperation on reducing the size of the atmospheric ozone hole. Lovelock's influence was widely felt, and he was active as a public scholar and author right up to his death this year. Journalist Roger Highfield says of Lovelock, quote, "As the planet lurches towards a climate emergency and its life support systems falter, the need for visionary thinkers with fresh insights and big ideas." We've got the mic going, yeah? Okay, and excuse us for the interruptions. Has never been more pressing. No wonder then that the world mourned the death of James Lovelock, whose Gaia theory provided a new framework to think about nature, one that changed the way we regard our relationship with the Earth. To begin with a definition, Lovelock, in his 1979 book, Gaia, explains that Gaia is the hypothesis, the model in which the Earth's living matter, air, oceans, and land surface form a complex system which can be seen as a single organism and which has the capacity to keep our planet a fit place for life. Very soon after the initial development of Gaia theory in the early 1970s, Lovelock began to work with biologist Lynn Margulis. Margulis was a microbiologist who developed and expanded the concept of endosymbiosis, which is, according to her, the idea that our complex cells depend on simpler tenets. Two of the most widely recognized examples of endosymbiosis being the way 2 billion years ago plant cells abducted single-cell organisms that could turn sunlight into food, photosynthesis, or the fact that mitochondria, the energy factories of our cells, are descendants of bacteria that once traded chemical energy for a comfortable intracellular home. Margulis was interested in how oxygen was generated by life processes, and she shared Lovelock's thinking in favor of Gaia as a structure of complex nonlinear systems, feedback loops, and tipping points. For her part, Margulis recognized and expounded the links between Gaia theory, Gaian thought, and autopoietic systems theory. So together, Lovelock and Margulis eventually explained Gaia theory as the ability of Earth's life forms plus air, water, and soil, or biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, and pedosphere, to regulate ocean salinity, regulate the atmospheric oxygen, regulate global surface temperature, process carbon dioxide, and maintain biodiversity and ecosystem stability in favor of preserving a balanced environment for life on the planet. Regarding the partnership of Lovelock and Margulis, Michael Ruse says he was a chemist, she a microbiologist. So for them, the chief feature of life was balance, stability, or what is known as homeostasis. That is the maintaining of balance through dynamic interacting processes. Bruce Clark tells us that the creative chemistry of the scientific collaboration fashioned by Lovelock and Margulis combined his expertise in chemistry, geology, physiology, and cybernetics with her profound grounding in microbial evolution and ecology. Over time, they established a fully geobiological Gaia concept whose worldview-shaking import was not lost on its progenitors. Margulis described Gaia in multiple ways, saying that the physiologically regulated Earth is a living system, a single giant superorganism. And she writes, life optimizes the environment for its own use. The planetary environment is homeostatic. Homeostasis is maintained as an emergent property of the interaction among organisms and the spherical planet on which they reside, and an energy source, the sun. From the start, conventional scientists uniformly rejected the work of Lovelock, Margulis, and the Gaia hypothesis. Biologists disliked Gaia, earth scientists disliked Gaia, and chemists were unhappy with Gaia. Lovelock and Margulis rose to this challenge. For example, Lovelock went in the direction of developing a computer model to demonstrate the role of feedback loops in climate regulation, a central principle of the Gaia hypothesis. Lovelock's digital parable was called Daisy World and demonstrated a systems property that today seems almost simplistic in its straightforward explanation of climate modeling. Daisy World showed a hypothetical planet populated with black and white daisies, where the lighter flowers thrived in a warmer climate and the darker ones when it was cooler. Because white daisies reflect more sunlight and black daisies absorb it, the spread of either variety creates a feedback loop that keeps the climate constant. Daisy World cemented Lovelock's nascent Gaian complex systems ideas and opened up ways for mainstream scientists to understand, test, get comfortable with, and eventually embrace the idea of Gaia. These days, every first-year environmental studies student learns that as the warmed atmosphere melts snow, glaciers, sea ice, and ice caps, the decreased albedo or reflective capacity of the expanse of whiteness allows more heat to be absorbed by the Earth, further warming the climate. This is an example, of course, of a positive feedback loop. Positive in this case meaning enhancing a system and moving it away from equilibrium, more melting, more warmth, more melting. While negative feedback loops tend to dampen or buffer a system, more of one element leading to less of another to maintain greater stability. So the albedo effect is essential to climate science and is exacerbated by the simultaneous warming effects of the increased dark open water surfaces with less ice, more heat absorption, and with increased water vapor in the atmosphere, where it acts as a blanket, also favoring more atmospheric warming. Lovelock proposed and supported such a mechanism as this with the theoretical parable of Daisy World. And this began to bring his Gaia theories from mockery to acceptance within the scientific community. The public, however, almost always and sometimes quite enthusiastically embraced Gaia, as Lovelock and his theories became a muse of the early environmental movement. That Gaia was romanticized by ordinary citizens as the earth goddess that she is named for did not help persuade mainstream science to take the hypothesis seriously. Eventually, however, the international scientific community came around, and the first conference on Gaia theory was held in 1988. Lovelock and Margulis's vision was extended by many other scientists and sociologists and philosophers of science. For example, Earth systems scientist Timothy Linton began researching and writing about climate tipping points, where small changes can irreversibly push climatic or ecological conditions into a different state. Think about the point at which deforestation of the Amazon propels its rainforest ecology into a permanent condition of a savanna. Notably, the philosophers of science, Donna Haraway and Isabel Stengers, and philosopher and anthropologist Bruno Latour critiqued, embraced, and transformed the Gaia hypothesis of the Earth as a living system that maintains its own homeostasis in favor of life. Linton began to talk about Gaia as a self-aware superorganism. By this, Linton meant that collective action by humans could create positive tipping points, moving systems and people into behaviors that achieve greater sustainability for this planetary organization. Consider as an example the potential sustainability tipping point from humans eating less meat. As expanded and designed by Linton, Gaia 2.0 is the possibility that humans can deliberately limit their impact on planetary systems, shown here, so that the Gaian operating system upgrades and self-corrects. How does Gaia work as a superorganism? Just the way a human sweats and shivers, says Ruse, as the temperature changes, so the living Earth adjusts its gaseous mantle to accommodate its temperature changes. Gaia theory therefore says that Earth is a living being in this delicate state of balance and harmony, and we all have a responsibility for her well-being. Bruce Clark says, contemporary scientific and scholarly attention and debate at large have precipitated a bona fide discourse of Gaia theory. The academic mainstreaming of many of Lovelock's and Margulis's formerly controversial ideas has coalesced in research fronts such as Earth systems science and astrobiology. Informed evocations of Gaia theory, he goes on to say, now accompanying a growing sense of emergency over an Earth system in peril of entering a new regime inconducive to many current life forms, including, of course, our own. The rise of Gaia theory preceded and prepared for the current recognition of a global climate and environmental crisis. These trends have run together with the arrival of a discourse of the Anthropocene, through which to acknowledge that massive accumulation of humanity's activities has now altered the functioning of this Earth system. Gaia is systems thinking at and for the planetary level. We will discuss the relationship of Gaia theory to the concept of the Anthropocene, and I will definitely move into a discussion of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous paradigms of understanding planetary systems, but I would be remiss in not taking this opportunity to also pay homage to another influential environmental thinker, Bruno Latour, the French philosopher, anthropologist, and sociologist of science and technology who died last month on the 9th of October. Some of Latour's work is intimately connected to Lovelock, Margulis, and Gaia theory, so I'll briefly make the connections here. Latour's ultimate project, Gardels tells us, was to dismantle the conceptual division between humans and nature in the modern mind, and to understand the world as one hybrid unity that includes animals, plants, topography, climate, the biosphere, human invention, and the interactions among them. Stephen Weke says it is not the case, Stephen Weke says that this form of modernity should be recalled, the current form of modernity should be recalled, and this is what Latour argued. Like a defective product, these are Latour's words, recalled and rebooted through new diplomatic negotiations with other cultures who may not need this kind of modernization, are rethinking its importance as our era is besieged by common crises. Mueke continues, paradoxically, finding solutions to a common crisis like the climate requires a plurality of knowledges. Solutions to problems like these need to come from all fronts. Reductionism is not going to help us. For Bruno Latour, reductionism is epistemic arrogance. For example, Latour developed actor network theory, a radical, even revolutionary way of seeing the world that recognized the agencies of all that is non-human, objects, machines, animals, plants, and even Earth itself. But note, however, that the idea of agency and animacy of all that is non-human is foundational to the epistemologies or knowledge paradigms of the indigenous cultures of West Africa. So we will return to this idea of what is and what is not new knowledge. Finally, what we notice in Latour's emphasis on ontological pluralism is that we need to move out of this dichotomy between nature and culture, between the science and the humanities. And when we move out of modern understandings of how our world is constituted and into the Anthropocene, everything changes in ways that Latour's pluralist, anti-reductionist philosophy helps us understand more clearly. Humans have caused the climate to change, so it is no longer external to us in the way that we used to think when we are happy to see ourselves in culture while everything else, animals, plants, stars, climate, was in an objective and largely passive nature. For Latour, the climate, as an entanglement of human and non-human factors, has pervasive plural effects, the kind that call for a radical empiricism that incorporates the sciences and the humanities. This is also Stephen Weke. Quote, Latour's thought and method is a bit like that of the German polymath Alexander von Humboldt, who traveled the world in the 18th and 19th centuries as a scientist, philosopher, and artist, immersing himself in different environments, making scientific calculations, philosophical interpretations, and even drawings. Both practiced methods of careful, detailed description that reached across disciplinary boundaries. The two cultures divide between the sciences and the humanities is as irrelevant today as the corresponding artificial division between nature and culture. Artificial because our pluralist worlds are better described in a multi-realist fashion. Latour spoke to us of future possibilities and dangers, and he showed us how to think with the things of the world, respecting their right to exist and act on their own terms. This radical reorientation is his legacy, and through it, the climate crisis became an opportunity for a renaissance, a reset of the sciences, the arts, the law, and politics, an escape from thought turning in circles in these self-validating disciplines. Through it, he offers us hope for a new kind of civilization, one in which we put aside human mastery and learn the languages of rivers, mountains, oil pipelines, baboons, and viruses. For these are the many murmurs of Earth itself growing louder and louder. There is something fundamental that is missing in the tremendously important ideas, theories, and propositions of both of these esteemed thinkers. And what is missing is that these theories were not new. The Earth as a living, self-aware system capable of feedback and self-correction, especially in its regulation of the climate, is an essential understanding of indigenous knowledges, which predated Lovelock's considerations by many thousands of years. This is equally true of Latour's ideas about the agencies of all non-human animate and inanimate objects. These essential understandings have been evident for millennia in humans' desires and abilities to learn the languages of plants, rivers, mountains, oil pipelines, baboons, and viruses. Limiting ourselves just to the recent time, 20th and 21st century expressions of indigenous paradigms, so we don't get caught up in debates around anthropological and historical relativism, we see many examples of object agency, planetary identity, and Earth systems regulation among indigenous peoples. This evening, after the lecture, we will watch a film on Inuit environmental knowledge paradigms. One Inuit cultural figure is called Sila, and it's a concept similar in many respects to the concept of Gaia. According to Inuit author Rachel Kitswalik and Indigenous scholar Zoe Todd, Sila, translated to English as the breath of life, is the animating principle of all life on Earth. Sila is represented as the breath of the Earth, the energy that drives life, also manifested as tangible weather and climatic patterns. Like Gaia, Sila is the combination of life force and climate regulation. I admit that Lovelock, like Latour and most Western-trained scientists, was likely ignorant of the millennia of indigenous thinking that paralleled his brainchild, Gaia. So that makes it all the more worthwhile to point out and to be reminded that humans had come to the Gaian conclusion in other ways at earlier times. Thank you. We philosophers, academics, and scholars from indigenous and other marginalized peoples wait for the acknowledgement, the citations of our established or previous ways of knowing that inform and parallel the lauded contributions of Western scientists. These acknowledgements rarely come. Anthropologist Zoe Todd says of her attendance in London at a lecture on climate change by Bruno Latour, quote, "So I waited through the whole talk to hear the great Bruno Latour credit indigenous thinkers for their millennia of engagement with sentient environments, with cosmologies that enmesh people into complex relationships between themselves and all relations, and with climates and atmospheres as important points of organization and action. I waited to hear a whisper of the lively and deep intellectual traditions born out in indigenous studies departments, community halls, fish camps, classrooms, band offices, and friendship centers across Turtle Island, which is North America right now. It never came. He did not mention the Inuit or Anishinabeg or Niawak or any indigenous thinkers at all. And I was left wondering, when will I hear someone reference indigenous thinkers in a direct, contemporary, and meaningful way in European lecture halls? No. Here we were celebrating a European thinker for, quote, discovering or newly articulating by drawing on a European intellectual heritage what many an indigenous thinker around the world could have told you for millennia. The climate is a common organizing force. Todd explains the consequences of this lapse in attribution in some detail. And she says, quote, "My concern here is not really with Latour himself, but with how a Euro-Western audience consumes Latour's arguments and the arguments of others writing and thinking about the climate, ontologies, or our shared engagements with the world without being aware of competing or similar discourses happening outside of the rockstar arenas of Euro-Western thought. I do not think Latour intended to ally decades of indigenous articulations and intellectual labor to render the climate a matter of common concern. Nor do I think he intended to suggest that his notion of the climate as a matter of common cosmopolitical concern was indeed the first of such calls. But the structures that produce talks like the one I attended make it easy for those within the Euro-Western Academy to advance and consume arguments that parallel discourses in Indigenous contexts without explicitly nodding to them or by minimally nodding to Indigenous intellectual and political players. Because we still practice our disciplines in ways that erase Indigenous bodies within our lecture halls, we unconsciously avoid engaging with contemporary Indigenous scholars and thinkers. That's Zoe Todd. If we recognize Earth as Gaia, ecological connections between humans and the planet become all about being kin or in a relationship with one another. Indigenous ecological knowledge maps onto a cosmology that privileges these concentric ecological connections. Specifically, this workshop series has been developed to reflect on the Gaia Hypothesis from an Indigenous perspective and to thereby deepen our understanding of planetary materials and their constellations from this perspective. Understanding the Earth as a cohesive system of relationships may support us while we're trying to create societal responses to our enormous environmental challenges. The Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force reminds us that to bring the climate back to balance is a matter of changing human consciousness from the thought of gaining for self to giving to others. We need to personalize the issue of climate change by examining and recovering our real spiritual understanding and beliefs that are buried under the consumerism and desire of greed. While there is no formal designation of Indigenous peoples in international law, according to a widely used definition, Indigenous peoples are those who lived on their lands before colonial powers claimed the land through problematic and unscrupulous doctrines of conquest and occupation. According to the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the United Nations, there are approximately 370 million Indigenous peoples globally, representing thousands of languages and cultures. Indigenous lands make up around 20% of the Earth's territory and contain 80% of the world's species biodiversity. There are many clans, tribes, and nations of Indigenous peoples throughout the planet, each of them with their own dreams, prayers, songs, wisdom, experience, guidance, and stories of the right relationship of humans to the natural world. While each of these cosmologies is unique and singular, they also share commonalities in vision and scope. Years of research has also shown us, according to Lee, that Indigenous peoples are the world's best land stewards and a crucial part of protecting biodiversity. The world's healthiest, most biodiverse, and most resilient ecosystems, especially forests, are located on protected Indigenous lands. That's according to a new study that suggests that protecting Indigenous and human rights is not only compatible with climate conservation goals, but key to future efforts. The Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity tells us something similar, that most Indigenous peoples and local communities inhabit areas where the vast majority of the world's genetic resources are found. Traditional knowledge may provide valuable information to researchers and others regarding the specific properties and value of genetic resources and their potential use. So you think of things like plant-based medicines, health products and cosmetics, and unique species of plants and animals. Joseph Lee tells us that recent research shows that the biodiversity losses that are devastating our planet are caused by colonization, appropriation, resource exploitation, and intensive land use. But the governance, institutions, and practices within lands inhabited by Indigenous communities support greater protection and biodiversity, especially for forested lands. There's a 2020 paper where he cites 47% of threatened mammals live on and are protected by Indigenous land management. Additionally, Indigenous lands tend to be home to high levels of natural resources, minerals, oil, and gas deposits, making these lands and peoples targets for corporate exploitation. Despite research highlighting the efficacy of Indigenous land management, global conservation efforts still prioritize fortress conservation tactics, a conservation practice which holds that humans must be absent in order for biodiversity to thrive. Or policies that permit unbridled resource exploitation, all of which lead to high levels of state and corporate-sponsored violence, human rights abuses, forced evictions, and murders against Indigenous communities and Indigenous activists. In a recent article co-authored by my colleagues here from the panel on planetary thinking, we hear from Chief Ninawa Inu, who's the hereditary chief of the Hunikui people of the Brazilian Amazon. And the chief tells us, for several generations, the indigenous elders have warned that there would come a time when the earth would collect the debt that we have with her. The earth is a living organism that is biointelligent and not an object of ownership or a natural resource to be managed. This is not a concept. This is a lived reality that is denied in modern societies. For most people in modern societies, the physical sense of belonging to the land is something unimaginable. The processes by which the knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples have come to be so disregarded and threatened has been deliberate and relentless. Erica Irene Dias reminds us of this history and says, quote, "The colonization of indigenous territories has affected indigenous peoples in a number of ways. Demographic deterioration occurred through maltreatment, enslavement, suicide, punishment for resistance, warfare, malnutrition to the destruction of the natural environment, or overexploitation of natural resources, disease, and outright extermination." Rudolfo Stavenhagen states that the entire population of the Americas was decreased by 95% in the century and a half following the first encounter with European settlers. We also note that the doctrines of dispossession, which emerged in the subsequent development of modern international law, particularly terra nullius and discovery, have had well-known adverse effects on indigenous peoples. The doctrine of terra nullius, as it is applied to indigenous peoples, hold that indigenous lands are legally unoccupied until the arrival of a colonial presence and can therefore become the property of the colonizing power through effective occupation. Strictly speaking, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the doctrine of discovery gave to a discovering state for lands previously unknown to it an inchoate title that could be perfected through effective occupation within a reasonable time. The doctrine, as it has come to be applied by states given to the discovering colonial power, free title to indigenous lands. And only recently has the international community begun to understand that such doctrines are illegitimate and racist. Brazilian academic Vanessa Machado de Oliveira explains the consequences of colonialism, or as she names it, modernity coloniality. And she says that this refers to the enduring manifestation of colonial relations, logic, and situations, even after the critical decolonization of formal structures of governance. Modernity coloniality imposes a mode of representation that claims both benevolence and universality for itself while denying its violence and unsustainability. While most critics of modernity coloniality associate it with the expansionist occupation of lands and the subjugation of peoples, many indigenous peoples see these manifestations of violence as symptoms of a deeper and older form of violence that happens at ontological and metaphysical realms, the realm of being. This deeper, older violence is the imposed sense of separation between ourselves and the dynamic living land that is the planet and beyond. This imposed sense of separation is based on human exceptionalism, the idea that humans are a superior species that deserve to conquer, dominate, own, manage, and control the natural environment, in addition to naturalizing separations and hierarchies between human and nature. Modernity coloniality also produces separations and hierarchies within humanity. The worth of bodies and cultures is tied to their perceived ability to produce knowledge in a specific way. Machado de Oliveira continues, the capacity attributed to certain bodies to produce knowledge of universal worth has historically been used to justify cultural and gendered supremacy and to rationalize the occupation of lands and racial subjugation and enslavement of peoples. Cultural supremacy secures a position where certain bodies are perceived to naturally embody authority and to be the legitimate arbiters of justice who are best fit to impose on other bodies what they believe to be objective and universal parameters and protocols for morality, ethics, economy, politics, and science. The primary orienting project is to control and engineer reality through objective, unequivocal knowing. Knowledge production in this context, focusing on a reminder that the benefits we associate with modernity are created and maintained by historical, systemic, and ongoing processes that are inherently violent and unsustainable. And it underscores the fact that modernity cannot exist without this. Machado de Oliveira further saying, that these consequences are not collateral damage of modernity, they're the necessary preconditions for modernity to exist. And so finally, she ends with explaining that to comprehend the forms of knowledge that have been endangered and the concepts that have been denigrated, let's return to this idea of Gaia theory, namely that the Earth can be conceived of as a self-regulating complex system. So what are some of these relationships that Indigenous knowledge are positing? We'll start with Raramurai scholar Enrique Salmon, who developed the idea of kincentric ecology. Salmon says, quote, "The land is a living entity and it is constantly in conversation with those of us who know how to listen to it. We as humans are directly related to all the natural world around us. The plants, the animals, the stones, they are our kin, direct relatives. Recognizing that reality can have a huge impact on our choices regarding the human-nature relationship. Without human recognition of their role in the complexities of life in a place, the life suffers and loses its sustainability." Most Indigenous scholars write about ecological kinship in their work. John Hausdorfer tells us, in thinking about kinship, I think it's important to begin with what are the boundaries of kin? We can go internal and microscopic, down to the nerves that actually inform our brain, right down to the microbes, not only managing our health, but informing our way of being and interacting with the world. And then we can go all the way out, right to our own families, to the human and greater than human world, out to the cosmos, the fact that we are made of stardust. Kinship reaches very far. There are many other examples of Indigenous expressions of the kinship paradigm in regard to land and all that exists in a given land base. Dias tells us that the relationship with the land and all living things is at the core of Indigenous societies. For example, the land tenure system known as Kipat of the Limbu Indigenous people of Nepal provides a means of belonging to a place and to a distinct community, the one not separable from the other. Kipat defines them as a tribe. According to one authority, Kipat is fused with and articulates the culture, and any assault on Kipat, the land tenure system, is seen as a threat to the very existence of the Limbu. Dice continues, their Aboriginal Australian vision of property is of ecological space that creates human consciousness, not an ideological construct or a fungible resource. Their vision is of different realms enfolded into a sacred space. The notion of self does not end with their flesh, but continues with the reach of their senses into the land. According to a recent article in The Guardian, Australian Indigenous elder Adrian Baraguba recently described his community's reaction to the Adani Mining Company project in his native Queensland. Baraguba said, "The mine will tear the heart out of our country, permanently destroying our ancestral homelands, as well as sites and species we have held sacred for generations. This threatens the survival of our culture and our ability to pass that culture on to our future generations." Finally, scholar Robert Williams states that Indigenous peoples have emphasized that the spiritual and material foundations of their cultural identities are sustained by their unique relationships to their traditional territories. The land is not merely a possession and a means of production. the entire relationship between the spiritual life of Indigenous peoples and Mother Earth and their land has a great many deep-seated implications. Their land is not a commodity which can be acquired, but an element to be enjoyed freely. Here's a curious research story that seems to provide an opportunity for a window to open between Western knowledge and Indigenous paradigms, as well perhaps between science and the humanities. So published in Ecology and Science Online in August 2021, Rachel Fritz wrote an article titled Mind-Blowing, Grizzly Bear DNA Maps Onto Indigenous Language Families. Fritz begins by describing the research of conservation scientist Lauren Henson, who has discovered 3 distinct genetic lines among Canadian grizzly bears who otherwise could freely mix within their given territory in British Columbia. Each genetic group of bears precisely matches the territory where an Indigenous language group is spoken. Fritz says, the bears and Indigenous humans of coastal British Columbia have lived side by side for millennia in this densely forested region on the west coast of Canada. A new analysis has found that the grizzlies here form 3 distinct genetic groups, and these groups align closely with the region's 3 Indigenous language families. When the researchers analyzed the genetic interrelatedness of bears both within and outside the area's 3 language families, they found that grizzly bears living within a language family's boundaries were much more genetically similar to one another than to bears living outside the boundaries. It's a finding that shows how cultural and biological diversity in the region are intertwined, says Jesse Pope, an Indigenous environmental scientist at the University of Guelph, who is not involved with the work. While the Western scientists use the words odd, strange, bizarre, weird, puzzling, and mind-blowing to describe their findings in this research project, the local Indigenous communities were nonplussed. They were completely unsurprised by the results. Local tribes talked about common needs for natural resources between humans and bears, and a specific human sensitivity to natural resource management that takes the requirements of both humans and grizzlies into account. For example, tribes always consider how much salmon to harvest in a given season based on their monitoring of the bear's health and the bear's needs for salmon. This resource monitoring encompasses both the traditional practices of conservation science and the traditional ecological knowledge of the local groups. It is resource monitoring that considers both bears and salmon as kin to humans, as cultural partners and family members, joined to each other by their long-standing relationship to the landscape. Researchers said the explanation the research partnerships favor is that the landscape has shaped bears and humans in similar ways. But Indigenous elders in the area talked about the bear communities as their relations, with one elder reminding us that it was the bears that gave humans their ability to use language in the first place. Over recent decades, according to Clark and Szewski, Western-trained critical thinkers and their non-Western interlocutors have been seeking a way out of the dilemma of presenting Indigenous knowledge as merely a colorful instant of cultural diversity. An increasingly admissible alternative is the proposition that knowledge systems of Indigenous or traditional peoples are not so much culturally variegated ways of making sense of an ultimately commensurate reality as they are ways of constituting irreducibly different worlds. Detailed ethnographic accounts of the way that non-Western people conceive of rocks that listen, sentient forests, interventionist mountains, glaciers that are capable of moral judgment, and dingoes that make us human have been presented as evidence that the world can be ordered in ways otherwise than the Western model. In particular, varying attributions of intentionality, sentience, and moral or political power in such stories have been marshaled to show how the Western division between an insensate nature and restrictively human realm of reasoned activity is but one of many possibilities for apportioning worldly agency. Theorists and activists from formerly colonized regions have been making the case that overcoming colonization is not simply a matter of transforming unequal relations, but a task of reimagining subjectivities, identities, and cultural formations distorted by oppressive colonial worldviews, sometimes shorthanded as decolonizing the mind. Along with overturning racialized ontologies, this project seeks to revitalize the multitude of ways of knowing self and world that were disavowed by globalizing Western thought. We come towards the conclusion of this lecture, and I'd like to probe the implications of what we've said so far about Gaia theory and indigenous knowledge. What are the implications of this for action that we will locate under the general topic of environmental futures? So astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson says, we are stardust brought to life by the universe so that the universe can figure itself out. We are made of the elements burning at the heart of stars and share these elements with planets, asteroids, and other bodies in this universe. The theme of the panel on Planetary Thinking Fellowship for this year has been Planetary Materials. And while the panel has generously allowed us as scholars and artists to interpret the meaning of planetary materials as broadly or narrowly as we saw fit, the planetary material that most fascinated me in my research was DNA. My first degree is in biology, so perhaps that's not a surprise that I have a fascination with and interest in genetics. And my international development specialty was in health, democratic institution building, and national level post-traumatic stress. So as a trauma specialist, I'm very interested in the new research on epigenetics, how trauma is inherited and can change gene expression. But at the basic level, DNA is the storage, carrier, and transmitter of information, or knowledge, or you could say stories. And there's an epistemology of genetics that fascinates me, especially given the implications from genetic correlations, like the one that we just heard about between the Grizzlies and their indigenous communities. Quote, humans, animate and inanimate beings, we all have in common the DNA of a star. This message causes me to ponder the nature of who we really are as humans. How are we of cosmic origin, and what does this mean? And how can we imagine being in a network of knowledge and kinship with everything on this planet, perhaps with all of the cosmos? The climate change crisis signals a necessary shift from referring to the global to contemplating the universe and the planetary. Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty reminds us that a planetary framework responds to the complicated scale of our current environmental actions and their consequences. Chakrabarty tells us that the global is human-centric and the planetary enacts a necessary decentering of the human. Cameroonian public intellectual and philosopher Akili Mbembe defines the planetary as a connection between life and its futures on the one hand and the living earth on the other. Because of the existential threat that the climate crisis represents, and because of the symbiosis between the human and the non-human, Mbembe says there is no longer a social history separate from natural history. Human history and earth history are no longer indivisible. So listening to all of this and our frame of reference as a planet within the cosmos, what is the work that these scholars and activists are asking of us? And one thing we're being tasked with is to uncover, acknowledge, and develop new paradigms of thinking and behaving, and to insist that some of us employ these skills of transdisciplinarity. I love this kind of funny quote from Edwin Schrödinger of the Cat in the Box fame, who famously says, "I can see no other escape from this dilemma, the difficulty of linking insights from multiple disciplines, than that some of us should venture to embark on a synthesis of facts and theories, albeit with secondhand and incomplete knowledge of some of them, and at the risk of making fools of ourselves." However, while truly transdisciplinary thinkers may be rare, it is rarely a foolish exercise to link insights from multiple disciplines. Indigenous paradigms are inherently transdisciplinary, but in fact, to speak of disciplinarity in reference to an indigenous worldview is to engage in an inconsistency. There's nothing in an Indigenous way of being that is actually siloed into religion or science, chemistry or psychology, medicine or creative arts. They're all integrated into a cosmology of life. We've been graced with frequent and really quite astoundingly detailed new photographs coming from the recently launched James Webb Space Telescope. And Kata Karath describes what many of us may be experiencing and says, as the new telescope brings us unfathomable images of faraway corners of the universe, we tend to forget how it feels to gaze up at the sky with our naked eyes. Since the dawn of humanity, the skyscape has always inspired awe and wonder. And throughout generations and succeeding cultures, we began to cultivate an intimate, practical relationship with the skies day and night. Until writing, calendars, and clocks became widespread, people across the globe relied to various degrees on the cyclical nature of celestial phenomena to plan agricultural and animal husbandry activities, explain the unknown, record stories, and navigate across land and sea. We tend to hear the words mystery and awe as sentimental ideas, and when it's associated with Indigenous communities as superstition. And this is hardly realistic, as affect has eternally been a part of the Western scientific tradition as well. Awe is what helps to generate curiosity, insight, and the desire to create and test new hypotheses. This is precisely what we need as we collectively approach the challenge of the climate crisis. Regretfully, we fully expect COP27, the annual climate change conference of the parties that's taking place right now as we speak in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, coming to a close on November 18th, to be a failure. COP26 in Glasgow was not deemed a success, as although countries did reach agreement to reduce emissions, the standards they agreed to will not limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. COP26 seemed to be a gathering event for the leaders of big oil and big politics, while civil society witnessed with considerable dismay our headlong continual plunge into a destructive Anthropocene. Let's see if COP27 will fare any better. I'm not really hopeful that it will. There's considerable debate about what marks the beginning of this period, the Anthropocene, and even if the name itself is specific to the current experiences of ourselves and the Earth. We can also remember that the Anthropocene we is not an undifferentiated whole, as not everyone on the planet has or has had the same impact on the planet's resources and climate. Indigenous communities who have contributed the least to modernization, industrialization, and the destructive behaviors of the Anthropocene are those communities faced with the most immediate and dire consequences of those behaviors. And Indigenous researchers also remind us that it's hubris to think that environmental crisis or an environmental societal collapse is something we're trying to avoid only in our future, since colonialism ushered in trauma, crisis, and apocalypse to Indigenous and subjugated communities at the very beginnings of the imperialist projects. As we continue to embrace the degree of our responsibility for damage to our environment, we can equally embrace the necessity of reparations to the environment and these communities. This begins with understanding that Indigenous peoples have been experiencing the environmental and social crises of imperialism for many centuries and are living in places that have already suffered the traumas of an environmental apocalypse. Finally, Rowan and Hasby tell us that the question is, are there alternate epistemic entry points for historicizing and interpreting these mounting ecological costs? Listening to Indigenous wisdom is an alternate epistemic entry point that gives us a chance to respond to a post-material necessity for our own survival. When Bell Hooks talks about love as the practice of freedom, she also says, the absence of a sustained focus on love in progressive circles arises from a collective failure to acknowledge the needs of the spirit and an overdetermined emphasis on material concerns. We owe to Gaia a debt of responsibility and care. And what Hooks is saying is that an effective ethic of love turns us away from the ethic of domination that has driven our actions collectively for too long and with far too much destruction. To embrace Indigenous paradigms for understanding the living earth is to accept the needs of the spirit and definitely to love the planet as if she is a relative and as if our lives depend on it, as if our lives depend on our human care, concern, and compassion for the earth. Aldo Leopold noted in a Sand Country Almanac, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Despite my years of immersion in environmental studies and expertise on climate science topics, this summer I was plunged into a new level of climate grief. I think this was made more evident to me by the confluence of the "are we still doing this" pandemic, the war in Europe, the as yet still only political civil war in the US, the climate catastrophes in Pakistan and Somalia, research on my book about planetary futures, and my boundless hope and joys for my beloved grandson, Nazir. As a response to my disheartened mood, I developed an accompanying visual arts exhibit around climate grief that consists of a collaged book of condolences with remembrance cards where you're invited to sit at the table, view the entries, and record your feelings about the passing of our historical and current relationships with the earth. Chakrabarti calls this grief climate anxiety. And he says that Anthropocene deliberations about our responsibilities and futures on the planet begins the development of an epical consciousness that asks the questions, how might humans use the resources of their moral capacity to regulate their life as a biosocial species among other species? The Rocks Media Collective gives us this prompt. Without a recalibration of the senses at the level of our global species being, without at least half a conversation to understand and then attenuate and nuance our desires and needs, we cannot conceive of another mode of production, another set of social relations, another ethic of husbandry between ourselves and the earth. So ultimately, while Lovelock operated both inside and outside of the mainstream institutions of science, he wanted acceptance and respectability. Yet, until his final years of life, he continued to refer to the Gaian operating system using the feminine personal pronoun she. Lovelock also argued for a Gaia 2.0 that would encompass deliberate human actions to live within the complex operating systems of this planet. While Lovelock, Latour, and Margulis did not sufficiently embrace or cite the indigenous paradigms that significantly predated their ideas, we can still take much from the ways that they offered an explanation of a living earth and the influence that they were able to exert on mainstream Western scientific communities. In conclusion, we need new philosophies that respect and learn from the manner in which indigenous knowledge about planetary thinking and planetary materials is connected with the climate crisis. Philosophies that explore the range of possible shifts in humanity's environmental knowledge, behaviors, and practices. If we think differently about what the earth is made of, what will that help us make necessary changes in our environmental behaviors? How can shifts in perspective help us move towards more sustainable care for ourselves, each other, and the planet? What we are doing is making new origin stories that respond to these extraordinary times of environmental and social crisis. Let's remember what is at stake in this project of a new way of being in relationship with our living earth system, Gaia. In the words of Ellie Mae O'Hagan, if grief is the only register through which one engages with climate change, then it is nothing more than self-indulgence. Grief certainly isn't action. And Rebecca Solnit once wrote that hope is not a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is not the act of fantasizing about something wonderful happening. It's a survival instinct. Hope does not replace despair, it rebels against it. Hope is the axe you break down doors with in an emergency. But first, you need to recognize that the house is on fire. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for having me here, for inviting me, to Professor Leggevi and to the entire panel on planetary thinking. And thank you so much, Claudia, for your lecture and for having me be a part of the events and also your artwork, right? Art events tomorrow. Very much looking forward to everything. So, and it's great that you started your lecture with saying, yeah, it's storytelling time, right? And I'm, in a sense, picking up on that aspect, which is what you get when you invite a literary scholar, I guess, because my response is titled Narratives of Environmental Knowledge in the Anthropocene, right? I just want to start out with one of the central claims that eco-narratologist Erin James makes in her recent 2022 monograph, Narrative in the Anthropocene, which concerns her assessment and her broad grouping of scholarly philosophical responses to the new geo-era of the Anthropocene into roughly two groups. So she says one approach to the question of narrative in the Anthropocene, which she sees exemplified in scholars such as Val Plumwood or in Ursula Heise, lies in environmental humanities perspectives that, quote, position narrative as part of the problem of and solution to environmental crisis, end of quote. Such a view, she describes, ultimately implies, I'm quoting again, that a key factor in today's environmental challenges are the types of stories that we tell each other about the environment. Change the stories, these scholars suggest, and change the damaging attitudes and behaviors that have brought us up to this point, end of quote. In opposition to this position, James reads in thinkers such as Claire Colebrook or Timothy Morton a, quote, second group of critics who link narrative and the Anthropocene in a much less optimistic way, as they suggest that narrative is a rhetorical, mode deeply unsuited to our current epoch. So some people, she says, or assesses, and it's a bit too radical in my view because there are many, many shades in between, and many would not agree with being put in that group or that group, but there are positions that say, okay, narrative needs to be changed and needs to be instrumentalized in a certain way, and others that reject narrative in the way it's understood, at least nowadays, that it's too anthropocentristic and deeply unsuited, right, as she calls it. So while I'm not entirely sure that one can easily pit these two positions as clearly against one another as James does, I do think that the distinction is productive for our thinking about diverse forms of environmental knowledge in a new planetary age. It gives us an opportunity and a starting point to think about the relation of narrative to the creation, developments, and distribution of environmental knowledge or environmental knowledges, especially such forms of environmental knowledge addressed by Gaia or indigenous forms of knowledge, as you have presented them, and as the film will also present them. In my response, I want to, which is also a bit foreshadowing at points, but not spoiling the movie, right? But relating to the movie a little bit. So in my response, I want to sketch three distinct ideas, aspects, you could say, or perhaps rather, let's call them speculative propositions intended to open up discussion also further, rather than provide answers, fixed answers, of course. So I want to pick up three propositions and ideas regarding forms and acts of narrating environmental knowledges at a point when we recognize humanity as a geophysical planetary power. My first proposition or first observation that struck me about your project and in your lecture, and also while watching the film already, was the way in which Gaian indigenous forms of environmental knowledge allow us to address questions of scale anew in ways that, in my view, go way beyond current Anthropocene viewpoints. So one of the problems addressed by scholars of the Anthropocene and climate change in the humanities is, of course, this big question of scale, the question of how we address, experience, imagine, communicate on spatial and temporal levels, the notion of the Anthropocene as we come to think of the human and think the human simultaneously as a species. As Ursula Heise, drawing from Dipesh Chakrabarty's work, asks, quote, if the Anthropocene indeed calls for a scaling up of the imagination, how might that imagination translate into narrative? What characters and plot architectures would it involve? What models do existing narrative forms offer for telling the story of our climate change presents and futures? End of quote. In this respect, while this is, of course, very specifically related to literature, talking about plot and plot architectures, characters, and so on, I think that your project really, and its exploration of forms of environmental knowledge also really holds the potential to speak even much more deeply than in a literary context to such questions of narrative forms. Environmental knowledge, after all, is always narrative. It matters not simply how those narratives work within communities producing environmental knowledge, of course, but especially also in the sense of how they can interlink into global forms of environmental knowledge. This synthesis aspect, I think, is that you were talking about, so central here. And I mean, when we're watching the movie later, I just think it's very interesting to see how living the old ways really fuses in terms of matter and mind with the changes that occur globally, right, or on a planetary level. And the planetary is, in a sense, the language that they use to translate those dimensions, these scales, right? So in this sense, I think the first idea and a very and the proposition, in a sense, in response to your project for me, is to think further about this ability of scaling up the imagination. And I'm using Dipesh Chakrabarty's words here, scaling up the imagination through interlinkages between forms of Gaian environmental knowledges and the ways in which they are told, right? A second idea, second aspect that is very much related, of course, and that really struck me, was how much exploring various forms of indigenous environmental knowledges are rooted in modes of what you could call elemental thinking, right, as offering alternative ways to imagine and communicate the climate crisis. So while the environmental humanities discourses are very often focused on questions of genre when it comes to telling stories, right, Amitav Ghosh preferring the epic to the realist novel and so on, Ursula Heise suggesting sci-fi as a kind of good mode for telling stories in the Anthropocene, there is much more at work, I feel, in a movie such as the Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change, and more broadly, when we look at narratives of environmental knowledge in terms of an elemental mode of storytelling, right? So I think the movie, your lecture, your project, when viewed through the lens of the Anthropocene and its narrativization, interlink and correspond productively with what has become more and more prominent under the heading of elemental eco-criticism. That kind of field I was also interested in relatively recently, and it proposes, as one of its proponents, Macaulay puts it in a 2010 elemental philosophy in his book, it proposes to take into consideration how the elemental places, forces, phenomena of the world that surrounds us fuse into narrative, right? In the movie, I mean, of course, you can think about this in terms of classical elements, but you also have to think about the translation into periodic tables, into chemical, modern disciplinary formed elements. But I think the elements are really a lens that could enrich discussion of narrative subjectivizing these aspects, right? And I mean, when I'm looking at just the poster that for your lecture, I mean, there's Earth right there in the hands. What Earth is made of. I mean, there's also elemental thinking in this already, right? And so I think this is one road, and one of my responses. So in this sense, I think we may also perhaps connect this to the way in which elemental eco-critics understand the elements. Jeffrey Cohn and Lowell Duckert read the elements as what they call metaphor magnets, or they call it metaphor, but matter with an A, right? Not metaphor, but metaphor, meaning word and substance together transported. Right? This is their coinage in a sense. And so the second question or proposition for me in this relation to your project is really how can we relate elemental thinking, use elemental modes of thinking, not only to understand a Gaian interconnectedness, right, communicated through specific forms and traditions of indigenous environmental knowledge, but how can we use such modes of elemental thinking also to interlink forms of such knowledge narratively and on a planetary scale then. And a third proposition I'd like to, or a third thought that I'd like to add here, also open to discussion obviously, relates really to how such relationships and interlinkages among various forms of indigenous environmental knowledge could occur, how to interlink these forms of knowledge, right? How to fuse them, or not fuse them necessarily as making them one, but how can we relate them in deeper ways? And in this respect, I think coming from the Anthropocene angle, again, I want to relate this a little bit to another relatively drastic distinction that's sometimes made by scholars of the Anthropocene. Bergthal and Horn make this distinction, for example, between the eco-modernist perspective and a kind of ecological posthumanism, right? Ecological posthumanism saying, if you want to go with Dipesh Chakrabarty's two terms, homo and anthropos, the one would say homo, the kind of cultural being, it just needs to get better and it needs to modernize the planet, right? Or do we go with the anthropos and we need to radically change into a post-humanist state there? And I think that, your project also in ways responds to how these two positions really need to, there needs to be a third way, or many third ways maybe, but then there needs to be, this needs to be addressed, and I think it can be addressed also through strategies that you see and identify in indigenous forms of environmental knowledge, right? Asking what the Earth is made of offers ways to move into combinations of these eco-modernist or post-humanist variants, I think, and move into other futures, perhaps. So I think it's also interesting to look at your environmental knowledge, forms of environmental knowledge there, with respect to responses to these positions, right? And with that, I want to conclude my brief response here. And just, I think, to sum up, I believe that addressing such aspects of scalability, of the elemental thinking, perhaps, and a principle, of addressing links and relations to eco-modernist or post-humanist perspectives. I think that this is, central to your project and to the movie that we're going to watch, but more broadly, even that the hopefulness lies in Gaia and Gaian dimensions of forms of environmental knowledge, that this also links really to the question of narrative. And coming back to Aaron James and what I started out with, Aaron James' distinction between positions that reject narratives as too anthropocentric rather generally, or those that are looking for the right types of narrative. Perhaps it is exactly weighing and opening up different forms of indigenous environmental knowledges narratively, and accepting also that perhaps we do not understand everything there, right? This synthesis can only work if you allow what you called epistemic plurality, really also on an effective and even emotional level, I think. And with that, I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to discussing everything with you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for opening this up. I think you touched upon so many different angles, and there's at least some literary and narrative scholars here in the room, so I'm sure we could connect well with Aaron James' work and the narratives and the Anthropocene text. So, but now I'll open up the round of questions for the audience. Are there any further comments that connect to this or also open up different pathways for our discussion? Then if this is not that urgent and I don't see any in the chat yet, then I would use the opportunity because I would like, actually, if we talk about stories and which is the right narrative, then this immediately reminds me of Haraway, of course. So I'd like to ask the Haraway question. And because she famously calls for it matters what stories we use to tell other stories with, what it matters, and so on and so forth. I don't have to repeat her. So because actually I was really intrigued by your thoughts, Claudia, and your points that you made that thinkers like Lovelock or Latour, that they haven't paid enough tribute to these indigenous thinkers that are talking about very similar ideas. And when you mentioned Morton, I was also really struck by this idea of the hyper object of the climate, and then actually calling this an hyper object and using the term object in there, which seems so less effective than actually grasping the climate as I'm not exactly sure how you termed it, but you had a very nice saying of like a regulating force, or I'm not exactly, I don't really remember it exactly, but I was wondering what you thought about Haraway's approach, about her approach of trying to grasp entities as multi-species crowds that interact also with the technosphere. Because I was wondering, when you were mentioning about the relationships between stones, between rivers, between animals and people, I was wondering, is there a way that you can connect this to the technosphere of the 21st century? How does this relate to Haraway? And as one third aspect of the question, how does the idea of a kin-centric ecology address asymmetries of power? Because I know that Haraway is often being criticized for not paying enough attention to these asymmetries. So perhaps a threefolded question, if you're sorry about that, but it's like just too many ideas and we don't have that much time yet, so we'll try to keep it short. You probably have to come back. Or I'll give you the laptop. Yeah, I can also, if you, yeah, okay, then I'll leave it here.
Okay. That's well, those are three questions or one huge question. First, I'm not a Haraway specialist. I'm not someone who I know her work, obviously, and enjoy reading it, but that's not my specialty. One of the things that Latour, one of the conclusions he came to, before his recent death, was that there was a way to integrate technology into all of this. And I think I disagree with him on that point. I would argue that so far the human exploration of the possible uses of technology has been fraught with all of our hubris and errors, everything that we do well, and equally everything we do that's damaging and destructive. So, the whole imperialist, colonialist, and discriminatory regime that we've managed to have as a framework has implanted itself, just head on into things like AI and technology. And so I think we have to be careful there. I can't embrace technological response wholeheartedly or necessarily agree either with Latour or Haraway. And then I don't know where that leaves us. I think your question was really big. It's really a huge question, and maybe I'm not really getting to the essence of it. what would you say is the key thing that for you in those three questions?
Sorry for opening up too many
Yeah.
too many aspects. No, I think it was basically three aspects. First of all, whether you think that Haraway is addressing these indigenous thinkers more adequately as perhaps Latour or Lovelock did, and then the technology question. I think this is a great answer. Thanks for that.
Okay.
And then the last part was about the asymmetries
of
kin-centric ecology. Whether there is a way that indigenous cosmologies address that, because that's something that, for me, it sometimes seems missing. We focus so much on, it's great that we look at the relationships between animals, humans, and rivers, but we tend to overemphasize how great that is, right? Because there's violence here, there are asymmetries of power here, and only because we're relatives and kin doesn't mean we're not violent, and doesn't mean that we're always fair.
No, thank you for clarifying that. So on the first one, I don't think certainly Lovelock and Latour or Haraway sufficiently credit some of the prior knowledge. And as I said, I think that's because they don't know it exists and have perhaps not taken the time to research it. And the silencing of indigenous knowledge, the denigration of indigenous knowledge, pushing it aside as superstition has been a very thorough project. And so we do tend to react that way if we're Western educated, regardless, including myself, of course, in that. So I don't think that she sufficiently accounts for that. On the last one, I think, we're constantly in danger, and again, I include myself, of using our Western paradigm ways to explore a different paradigm that really does operate in a different way. And for me, because one, I operate in two worlds, I am both Western educated and from very indigenous, very traditional roots, so I'm constantly border crossing, and that's why I'm interested in this topic. And two, because I have literally lived all over the world and been immersed in very personal ways in these ceremonies where things happen that are not explicable to my Western trained mind, right? Whether it's a healing ceremony or a shamanic ceremony or whatever. So I've had the privilege to be immersed in those events as a family member, not as an anthropologist or a researcher, but as somebody who is in the community, related to and working alongside local people. And so I think that helps me a little bit more to translate these ideas. And I would say that one thing that most indigenous knowledgists say is that yes, humans do have a very specific role to play. While that role might be constituted very differently in different cultures, it is acknowledged that not that we are better than, but that we are a part of with a responsibility. There is something about our abilities to tell stories, to use language, however it's conceived of, that says that we acknowledge we have this, and that means we are responsible for. Think of Aboriginal Australia, they'll say we're responsible for dreaming the world into existence. And that means a very specific thing in Aboriginal thought. That's hard to translate, but certainly a lot of people have written about what it means, or singing the world into existence. So we have certain skills that we're able to do as humans. What that does is it does slightly change the power dynamic from looking at it from a Western point of view, because there, it's not relationships of power and hierarchy, they're relationships of various kinds of responsibility. And the family is constituted, as you can see in that diagram, in a circle. It's a cyclical relationship. And I learned when I was traveling that the linear kind of thought that we get from Western education is not universally shared around the world, even in some developed countries. So where we immediately go 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D in English or in German, right? That is not the way everybody approaches the world. So if you grow up in a way of thinking in this circular kind of situation, you have a different relationship to hierarchy. That doesn't mean there's not exploitation. It doesn't romanticize indigenous knowledge, but it does mean that we have to look at it differently, and that I think there is a fundamental difference in Salmon's concept of concentric reality when he talks about the stone being a relative. There's something that us as Westerners cannot quite grasp, not because we're not capable of it, but because we haven't been educated into that. But he's talking about it in a way that's different than we can quite grasp. And some of the hierarchy and power shifts in those relationships. That'd be my response.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
There's also a question in the chat, I guess. He's putting a plus. That means he probably wishes to share his screen. So did you allow him to?
Should be able to.
You probably have to make him and tell him that that it's his turn, because.
Oh, sorry.
Hey, okay, Fabrizio, you have a question. So if you'd like to share your video and talk to all of us, or you can also write it as so you can choose. Either share your screen with us directly or type it in. So he's wondering if the question of the body could be addressed in relation to the kind of critique of Latour and Lovelock from an indigenous perspective that was addressed here. It seems to him that in the same way that Latour and Lovelock forget to acknowledge that their theories of Gaia and hybrid resonate with modes of being and knowing of indigenous people, they also do not make much elaboration on the question of the body and gender, or do they? So thank you, Fabrizio. A really great question, I feel. And if you want to respond, you probably have to stand up again.
Thank you, Fabrizio. That is a great question. And, in general, I have to say that I'm not aware of either of those thinkers addressing that issue. Certainly some of the kind of post-colonial critique of their work addresses the way that they're operating as well under these kind of gendered frameworks. But no, I'm not aware of anything that either of them have written that addresses that as an issue. If somebody else is, I'd love to hear that. And I think it's a great project. It's a great something to do with this. Was it 1 or 10 million? A suggested research project, because I think that it would be important to critique the work from that point of view, certainly. So thank you for bringing that up.
I'm not sure whether he wanted to ask a follow-up. But
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, that was a bit difficult to do it quickly, this communication thing, but thanks so much for answering my question. I was very impressed by the presentation, and I was thinking that kind of question through the whole time, especially because so many pictures you showed us had that kind of relationship, right, of the female body or the body, and on relationship with these representations of this coexisting mode of being and knowing from indigenous people. So I was wondering if Lovelock and Latour somehow do not make that explicit, if you would say, or how you would actually think of that relationship from the perspective of the body or gender in relation to those indigenous knowledge that you were researching.
Oh, thank you, Fabrizio, for explaining that. I think that the Colonial Project, of course, included some very specific ideas about gender that were imposed on indigenous cultures that did not exist in their paradigms ahead of time. And, we're still just teasing out and, speculating on some cases what the previous understandings could have been, and the way that they vary from culture to culture. But certainly what we hear, and this is across the world, is that rigid divisions between gender roles was not a thing. That was something that was imposed, including what different genders did, and including some definitions of what those genders were, and including a much more expansive view of gender, not as a binary, whereas the Colonial Project really doubled down on the gender binary, which was not necessarily familiar to all indigenous cultures, or at least there were exceptions of that binary. But certainly, yeah, it clearly imposed roles, and we hear all kinds of stories. One of the stories they tell is about how they said that what was going on is that the men were doing the hunting, and so that's episodic, and the women were responsible for agriculture and were out in the fields, and that was diametrically opposed to what they were used to here in Europe, and so they set out to change that and told people that that was wrong and that the men should be working the fields. And so you hear lots of stories like this. This one in particular from South and Southeastern Africa. So I think that then imposes a certain gendered, and in that case embodied, routine on indigenous or traditional knowledge. But yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I wanted to just, I don't have any overall comments. I just wanted to open it up. I've done a little bit of research on the Inuit for a paper I wrote about, actually it's about their artwork. There's a collective of Inuit in Baffin Island that are famous for doing woodblock printing. And there's a whole really fascinating story. I wrote an article, I can share it with you or put it on the website if you'd like, about the relationship between the Inuit and how they were being inspired by traditional Japanese woodblock printing. And that's been going on for years now, over 50 years. They're actually quite famous for that. So in order to do that, I had to do some research on their culture, especially some of the relationships with animals, because animals feature in their artwork, especially the caribou and the seals. So I'm happy to try to answer questions in that way, but also just to take comments or any other questions. Yeah.
Does this work? Okay. Okay. Yeah. First, I have a very, I think, very general comment that I was thinking when people appear in the video, and some of them, I'm there. When people appear in the video and they say, some of them say, yes, like I really feel a lot of fear about what is happening, because as the permanent frost is melting, we know that we run the risk that our community will disappear. And I was thinking also in relation to something that I think you, Claudia, mentioned before, this idea of climate grief. And I was thinking like the potential of this concept, let's say, on how to connect these narratives of maybe indigenous peoples in like more related to particular territories, but also to narratives that I have listened in Western settings. Let's say, like I was studying in a University of mainly agricultural studies, so I was sharing with more life science people, and I know that many of them, not, I don't know if many, but at least for having close contact to some of them, I knew that sometimes some people can really have this strong climate anxiety, you know, and I think already there are like studies around this, and but I think that yeah, there is a potential in trying to look more into this idea as a transversal feeling. So thinking more in these feelings, maybe, yeah, it could be something connected to emotional political ecologies. Yeah, and then I was thinking, yeah, I would like to know if you have also dive a bit into these political ecologies, because I feel it's very, it could be related to what you have presented, but maybe it's like a different framework. It's just that a lot of things are overlapping. And then I have other questions, but I will stick to that by now.
I think this is working, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I think that you know, one of the things I found, and I think I mentioned, was the idea that climate grief, ecological grief, you know, the apocalypse already happened for indigenous communities during colonialism, and especially at the beginning with just the devastation of their communities, their lands being taken away. And kind of like the apocalypse has already happened in some ways, and it's been going on for generations. You look at appropriation efforts, boarding schools, you know, on and on. So, you know, indigenous researchers are reminding us that, you know, they've been in that grieving state for some time. And then, as it shows in this movie, because they're taught from as early as they can remember that this relationship with the environment, right? Go outside, get up in the morning and greet the environment, I think were the words that he used. And so to see it change like this so dramatically has got to be devastating, right? It's the same as if you talk to farmers anywhere and they talk about this constantly changing relationship that 25 years ago they didn't have to deal with, where they could predict what May was going to look like. There's not a farmer in the world now who can predict what the month of May is going to look like anywhere. But that farming is to be based on those predictions. And so they now have to act very differently. So I think anybody who's working with the land, living on the land, and having that close of a relationship feels the grief very intimately. They literally have their hands in their earth. So how could they not feel that grief? That would be one response I have. Then you asked about a political ecologist, and that's not really something I've gone into. I am writing a paper now dealing with political and ethical moral philosophy having to do with environmental change. And in this case, it's in relationship to migration issues. So it's a joint paper I'm writing with some other specialists. And we're looking at the work of Akili Mbembe, who I introduced, and a philosopher called Charles Mills, who recently passed away, and looking to see if their political and moral philosophy about how the world is structured, like if we can revisit, and this doesn't totally answer your question, but this is as close as I've gotten, like if we revisit the way we describe the world as being structured, can we actually find more a different ethical framework to relate to each other and to the destruction that we're causing? And like this gets back to narratives, right? If we're telling ourselves a certain story about the world, the way the world has been created, literally, but also about how our society, what modernization is, how our societies exist. If we revisit, not everybody is telling that story. So if we revisit the story and enlarge it mostly by bringing in these other narratives, is that going to be a path towards changing how we react to it? So that's kind of the closest I've gotten to in ecology.
Or like ethics.
Right.
Within.
And then, of course, with Mills specifically, he talks about the fact that, we talk about the social contract in political science and sociology, and that's a myth. There is no social contract. It was always a racial contract. And that by ignoring that, by not understanding the framing is one of the reasons that the things that we use to address some of these problems are not working, because we're starting with a limited framework that doesn't fully describe what's going on. So his work is really interesting to bring into this. And then Mbembe, of course, talks about the planetary and reframing the planetary from the point of view of Europe not being the center. That's his kind of his overarching question. Suppose we re-looked at all of this and looked at all the periphery, so-called periphery, as if they were the center. How would that tell a new narrative? What would that do for our ability to find solutions? I find it fascinating to enlarge those narratives, but I'm not sure that answered.
No, yeah, it's another path, no? And that you mentioned Mills. I was It's about epistemologies of ignorance.
No. Charles Mills, he just passed away, is a Jamaican philosopher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
I maybe have more of a comment than a question, but as you already told me that I would like the film, and I really did. So thank you so much for showing us. And I think because I think one aspect that I find that I guess it touched upon brilliantly and perhaps even unintentionally was a connection between what we talked about this morning. How do we maintain an ecosystem? How do we do wildlife management in an ecosystem-friendly way? How do we attribute rights of nature? And I feel like this film could be seen as a plea for a productive marriage between indigenous cosmologies, kin-centric ecologies, and wildlife management. Because with the whole polar bear scenario, first of all, at the beginning of the film, they were showing how humans hunt seals at the breathing hole. And later on, they show how suddenly the bears become a threat to the humans because the bears cannot hunt the seals at the breathing hole anymore because of wildlife management and conservation efforts. And this is ingeniously done, I think, from a cinematic perspective and also from a narrative perspective, of course. And I think that on the one hand, it's understandable perhaps that there's this antagonism between the indigenous leaders and the biologists because they are stealing their livelihood. They say they don't consult us and they impose laws upon us and then they steal our livelihood. We depend on hunting these animals. But then and they might be right that they should consult them. But then at the same time, they say, we do not touch the animals and the animals are not endangered. And I am really unsure whether this is true. Obviously, these animals are endangered. Obviously, their habitat is being destroyed. Obviously, some measures need to be taken, right? So with the article that you sent me a couple of weeks ago with the kin-centric ecology and wildlife management, I think these are brilliant examples of how you can combine these two cosmologies and not end up just choosing one side by neglecting the other, but like entering into conversation and not always fall into the defensive mode of our livelihood is being disrupted, so leave us alone, and the other saying, you're not scientific, leave us alone, but having a dialogue. And I think the film does it beautifully.
Also in terms of like really, I think how it kind of shows you how human bodily senses are used in the production of knowledge. That's kind of what struck me also. Because there's of course knowledge, the data and the southerners and so on. And I mean, it's very clear this is a different type of knowledge that also recognizes what we recognize, but we create knowledge on a completely different level, also through the same set of senses. Like when we read about data, we're using our eyes, we're trained to use them, and we're creating knowledge in a certain way. But especially these images, when you see what people are saying, especially in the beginning, and then you see the birds flying in shapes and in certain shapes, and you see how, I mean, this is reading, this is a narrative that they create out of their sensual experience, right? In various ways. And I think this is something like this kind of sensual history of environmental knowledges. I think this is really essential. Like, this is why I love this image of touching the earth with the hands, because I mean, this is also creating knowledge. It's also telling a narrative, and you can tell a narrative about how you have different ways where you can say, okay, one mode of knowledge is perhaps really good at doing that, but another can give you a completely different aspect of what might be at stake, you know? This is like these modes of knowledges I find really interesting in this movie, because it combines them, but it doesn't force them upon you, really. That's what I like so much about this.
So at the beginning, they said we are oral storytellers. It's stories of the mind. And then I was immediately reminded of this question of narrative and this question of, is there something violent in putting something down into text? And is oral storytelling a more flexible or a less violent means, or does it render us more attuned to listening to the narratives that the natural world tells us? And this is also where I disagree with Erin James' position, because she would say that narrative is an inherently human thing, and that narrative it was created by and for humans. But I think it depends on your understanding of narrative. And I think a formation of migratory birds is as much a narrative as the streets that ants forge into the sand is as much a narrative as a plant sending vibrations and exchanging minerals with fungi. So,
and how do I say it's not a narrative from that perspective? Perhaps something that I cannot say it's the same type of narrative, obviously, but it's nonetheless a narrative.
I would agree with that as well, that those are forms of narrative. I think, all of these are branches of human thought, right? There's nothing that we're seeing or talking about that is not something that humans are capable of doing. That doesn't mean that each of us is capable of all of them or needs to be. We don't need to feel like we need to, we don't need to feel like we must embrace indigenous paradigms in order to go towards these solutions, for so many reasons, right? We have to worry about appropriation, for one thing, and the access to knowledge, which is like part of the colonial project, was saying all knowledge is available to us as settlers, which was also a very violent regime. But I think what we can acknowledge is begin to acknowledge that we need to get rid of the hierarchy. And we're not coming to it from equal sorts of places of power. So it is important in the beginning to not see it as two people coming equally to a table to exchange, because there's no equality at all in the playing field or in the history. When one knowledge was so thoroughly attempted to be eliminated and discredited. So that also has to kind of acknowledged and figured into the negotiations. But at the end of the day, we're saying, how can we respect these different forms of knowledge, because we actually need all of them in order to go. And one is not hierarchically better than another. And as I said earlier, some of them are very different ways of knowing our world. And for us, I think, as one of our attorneys says, I don't understand this stuff. And sometimes that paradigm crossing, in my experience, can be physically uncomfortable. You've traveled a lot. Many of us here have traveled. When you get into a social or cultural situation and where you really don't understand what the people you're with are doing, you can actually feel a visceral sense of, this is so against what I grew up with or learned or knew or experienced, that I actually feel this physical sensation of discomfort. And I think we need to get past that, acknowledge it, it's real, but realize that all that is a feeling of discomfort. It's not a discrediting of what's going on.
Thank you so much. I think that was wrapping it up quite nicely.
No other questions?
Are there any other questions?
Audience? Nothing? Nothing in the chat?
And I guess would you like to close off with some concluding remarks, or should?
Oh, sure. I don't mind. I just want to thank everybody for coming and being so patient, and it's for a fruitful discussion and great questions. And I'm really looking forward to talking about this from a different perspective. I mean, they're the same questions, but I think when you're doing art and looking at art, it opens up a different part of you, right? Not necessarily the intellectual, the mind. It opens up the heart. It opens up the affect. I know for me as the artist, it does. It enables me to do this research in a much deeper way when I can kind of put it over there and use my hands. That's just, of course, who I am personally. But I'm looking forward to that other exploration. And I really want to thank Matthias for coming and giving such great remarks. It was really brilliant. So, yeah.
And thank Claudia, thank you for giving us this inspiring lecture, for offering us this beautiful film, and thanks everyone in the chat for staying on. And as all of you who are still here now know, that we will be doing a little gathering in the Liebigstraße 35 now to just continue the discussion, so just in a relaxed manner, enjoy some snacks and some drinks. So you're all warmly invited. So.